The day my father died, it wasn't just a parent I lost. It was the last, flimsy thread of dignity my family had left me. That's a hard thing to say, isn't it? To admit that the grief for a beloved father was immediately, irrevocably tangled with the raw sting of betrayal from the very people who should have been a comfort. But that's the truth of it. That's where this story starts. He was barely cold in his grave, honestly, the air still thick with the cloying sweetness of funeral flowers and the hushed, almost reverent tones people adopt around death. We hadn't even gotten to the official will reading yet, hadn't even given the lawyer a chance to unfold his papers and clear his throat. No, they were too eager for that, too hungry. We were all gathered in the sitting room, the same room where Dad used to read his newspaper, where he'd patiently help me with my math homework. The room that still smelled faintly of his pipe tobacco and old books. My mother was there, of course, perched on the edge of the velvet armchair like a queen on her throne. My Aunt Carol, Dad's sister, sat across from her, a picture of false sympathy. Her eyes darting around the room already mentally, redecorating, I'm sure. And then there was my sister Clara. Oh, Clara. She was beside Mom, looking appropriately mournful, but there was a glint in her eye, a tightness around her mouth that spoke of triumph, not sorrow. I remember standing by the fireplace, my hand resting on the cool marble mantelpiece. I didn't want to sit. I felt like if I sat down, I'd sink into the cushions and never be able to pull myself back out. My knees were weak, my head felt fuzzy, and the world was just a little too bright, a little too loud. I was trying so hard to hold it all together, to not let the tremor in my hands show, to keep the tears from blurring my vision. My father was gone, my protector, my rock, and even in that raw, aching space, they couldn't wait. It was my mother who spoke first, her voice surprisingly steady, almost businesslike. "Alina," she began, and that was it. That one word, my name, spoken with such a cold, flat finality, like she was closing a book, not addressing her own child. "Your father's wishes were clear." I remember thinking, clear to whom? Because Dad had always been fair. Dad had always tried to bridge the chasm that had grown between me and the rest of them. He was the only one. Then Aunt Carol chimed in, her voice a little too sweet, a little too saccharine. "Yes, dear, he wanted Clara to have everything. It's what's best for the family." Best for whose family? I wondered. Certainly not for the one that included me. But it was Clara's gaze that truly pierced me. She met my eyes directly, a flicker of something, not quite malice, but certainly an absence of warmth, of kinship, passing between us. "Dad always said I was better with money, Alina," she said, her voice soft, almost a whisper, but it carried in the quiet room. More practical, it hung in the air, a thinly veiled insult. "You're not practical, you're not smart enough, you're not worthy." No explanation, no apology, not even a feigned regret for my grief, for my loss, just a cold, decisive dismissal. Delivered with the practiced ease of people who had been doing this to me my whole life. It was as if I was a stranger who had wandered into their private family mourning, an uninvited guest to my own bloodline. The sheer audacity of it, the callousness, took my breath away more than the raw pain of my father's absence. They weren't just taking his things, they were erasing me from his memory, from his legacy. They were rewriting his story to fit their own narrative, one where I simply didn't belong. I felt a hot flush creep up my neck, a familiar sensation of indignation and deep, gut-wrenching hurt. But something else was there too, something new, a tiny, defiant spark. They think they know everything. They think they've won. I didn't argue. What was there to say? To whom would I argue? The stone faces before me weren't open to reason, or even to human empathy. They had already decided my voice, my feelings, my very existence in that room were irrelevant. So I did the only thing I could do. I took a deep, shaky breath, straightened my shoulders, and met each of their gazes. For a long, silent moment, I tried to convey everything in that look. The pain, yes, but also the shock, the profound disappointment, and something else they couldn't quite decipher, something that said, "You have no idea." Then without a word I turned, I walked away, each step a deliberate act of defiance. I didn't run, I didn't stumble, and I held back every single tear, every single one, because letting them see me cry, letting them see that they had broken me completely, that would have been the ultimate surrender. And a part of me, a part they didn't know existed, refused to give them that satisfaction. I walked out of that room, out of that house, and into a silence that was both crushing and, surprisingly, liberating. They thought they had seen the end of me. They had no idea it was just the beginning. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly have conceived of in their self-serving little world, was that Dad had seen this coming, not just in the weeks leading up to his death, but for years. He'd seen it in the way my mother's eyes would harden when I spoke about my dreams, dismissed as frivolous. He'd seen it in Clara's subtle snubs, the way she'd casually cut me out of family conversations, as if my presence was an afterthought, and he'd seen it most clearly in the constant, quiet erosion of my place in the family, a slow, steady chipping away until I felt like a ghost in my own home. It wasn't always like that. There was a time, long ago, when we were a family, or at least, I thought we were, but as I grew, and as my interests diverged from theirs, my love for art and books versus their obsession with appearances and social climbing, I became the odd one out. Dad was the only one who truly saw me, truly understood. He'd bring me books he thought I'd like, take me to art exhibits no one else cared about, and listen patiently to my sometimes wild ideas, never once making me feel silly or impractical. He was my anchor in a sea of unspoken judgment. About 6 months before he passed, when his health was already beginning to visibly falter, he called me into his study. It was a Tuesday evening, a chilly autumn night. The house was quiet, everyone else engrossed in their own separate worlds, Mom watching her usual primetime drama, Clara probably on the phone with one of her friends, discussing their latest shopping spree. Dad's study was always my favorite room in the house. It smelled of old paper and pipe tobacco, a comforting scent that always made me feel safe. He was sitting in his worn leather armchair, a blanket over his legs, a book open on his lap, though I don't think he'd been reading. He looked tired, yes, but his eyes, those kind, intelligent eyes, were as sharp as ever. "Alina," he'd said, his voice a little softer than usual, "come sit with me for a bit." I pulled up the small wooden stool he kept by the fireplace, the one I used to sit on as a child, listening to him read stories. He started slowly, talking about his life, his regrets, his hopes for the future. He spoke about how he'd built his business from nothing, brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice. He was never one to boast, but there was a quiet pride in his voice. "I built it to last, Alina," he'd said, looking directly at me. "Something solid, something that could provide for you all." Then he paused, and his gaze intensified. "But not everyone sees things the same way, do they?" I knew immediately who he was talking about. We both did. He didn't need to name names. The unspoken tension, the subtle dismissals, the coldness that often permeated the air when I was around. He'd felt it too. He knew how they treated me, how they'd always made me feel like an outsider. It broke his heart, I think, to see it. He'd tried, in his own quiet way, to mediate, to encourage a family bond that simply wasn't there for me. But he was losing that battle, and he knew it. "I've been thinking, Alina," he continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "about the future, about what happens when I'm no longer here." He took a deep breath, and I felt a pang of fear in my chest. He was talking about his death. He was preparing me. "I can't undo the way they've treated you. I wish to God I could. I wish I could make them see you, truly see you, for the intelligent, compassionate, capable woman you are." His words were a balm to my soul, a validation I hadn't realized I was so desperately craving. Just hearing him acknowledge it, openly and honestly, was a profound comfort. It wasn't my imagination. He saw it, he understood my pain. "But what I can do," he said, his voice gaining a quiet strength, "is make sure they'll never control what I built, not what I poured my life into, not what I intended to be a legacy of security and independence." My heart pounded. I had no idea what he was getting at, but a strange sense of anticipation, mixed with dread, began to unfurl within me. "I'm changing my will, Alina," he said, his eyes never leaving mine. "I'm leaving it all to you, quietly, legally, without telling a soul." The words hit me like a physical force. Everything, to me. It was almost too much to comprehend. My mind raced, trying to process the enormity of what he was saying. The shock was immediate, profound. I must have looked stunned, because he gave me a faint, sad smile. "I know it's a lot to take in," he said, "but it's the only way. If I left it to all of you, or even just to Clara, they would find a way to manipulate it, to control it, and by extension, to control you." They'd use it against you, Alina, they always have. But this way, they can't, this way, it's yours to build your own life on your own terms to be truly free. He reached out and gently took my hand. His touch was warm, comforting. This is not about punishment, Alina, he clarified, as if sensing my internal conflict. It's about protection. It's about ensuring your future. It's about putting things right, in the only way I know how. And in that quiet study, under the soft glow of the desk lamp, a secret was born. A secret that would lie dormant for months. A powerful seed planted in the fertile ground of my father's foresight and my own quiet resilience. It was a secret that would become my shield, my weapon, and ultimately my liberation. He couldn't undo their cruelty, but he could and did ensure they would never truly win. He was preparing the ground for the biggest shock of their lives. After that initial conversation in his study, the plan began to unfold with a quiet, almost conspiratorial precision. Dad wasn't a man of grand gestures or dramatic pronouncements, but when he set his mind to something, he moved with an unshakable resolve. This was different, though. This wasn't about business deals or community projects. This was intensely personal, steeped in a love so profound it sought to protect beyond the grave. The first step was finding the right lawyer, not the family's long-standing attorney, Mr. Harrison, who was practically a fixture at our Sunday dinners and who knew our family dynamics intimately, perhaps too intimately. No, this had to be someone discreet, someone unconnected, someone who understood the delicate nature of what Dad was trying to achieve. Dad had a network. Of course he always did. He put out quiet feelers, making vague inquiries that wouldn't raise suspicion. He settled on a firm in a neighboring town, one known for its meticulousness and, more importantly, its confidentiality. A lawyer named Ms. Evelyn Thorne. Our first meeting with Ms. Thorne was clandestine, almost cinematic in its secrecy. Dad made an excuse about a business inquiry that needed his personal attention out of town. He drove us there himself, a drive I remember distinctly. The autumn leaves were turning, painting the landscape in vibrant golds and fiery reds. A stark contrast to the quiet tension in the car. He didn't say much on the way, just squeezed my hand occasionally, a silent reassurance. I felt a mix of apprehension and a strange sort of exhilaration. We were doing something truly significant. Something that felt both illicit and profoundly righteous. Ms. Thorne was everything you'd want in an attorney for such a sensitive matter, sharp, composed, and with an air of quiet efficiency. Her office was neat, almost sparse, and her gaze was intelligent and direct. Dad laid out his intentions simply, without emotion, just the facts. He explained his desire for his assets to pass solely to me, bypassing his wife and other daughter entirely, and he made it clear he wanted this done in the most legally watertight way possible, leaving no room for contestation. He spoke about his concerns for my financial independence, his fears that without his direct intervention, I would be left vulnerable. He didn't explicitly badmouth Mom or Clara, but the subtext of their past treatment of me hung heavy in the air, understood by all three of us. Ms. Thorne listened intently, occasionally nodding or making a brief note. When Dad finished, she asked a series of precise questions, probing for any potential loopholes, any angle the family might try to exploit. Are there any existing agreements, any prior trusts? Are you concerned about undue influence claims, Mr. Morgan? She asked, her voice calm and professional. Dad assured her everything was above board. He was of sound mind, acting freely, and his intentions were purely to ensure my security. Then came the detailed work. For weeks, we communicated with Miss Thorne in hushed tones, through untraceable emails sent from new, separate accounts Dad set up, or during quick, unscheduled phone calls he'd make from his car. We went over every asset, the family business, the investments, the various properties he owned, even the significant art collection he had amassed over the years. Every single detail was meticulously accounted for. Dad was methodical, leaving no stone unturned. He wanted no doubt, no ambiguity. I learned a surprising amount during this period. I saw the true extent of Dad's foresight, his incredible attention to detail. He wasn't just leaving me money, he was leaving me a fully considered, legally robust inheritance. He made sure the will was drafted in a way that left no room for interpretation. He included specific clauses about disinheritance, ensuring that his wishes regarding Mom and Clara were explicitly stated. not merely implied by omission. This was crucial, Ms. Thorne explained. To withstand any potential challenges, he was not simply omitting them, he was actively, legally, excluding them from his final distribution of assets. He also started transferring smaller, less noticeable assets directly into my name. Well before his passing, little by little, quietly, without a ripple, these were things that wouldn't necessarily be covered by the will but would give me immediate access to funds if needed, ensuring I was never truly left without resources, even if something went wrong. With the main inheritance, it was another layer of protection, another testament to his unwavering care. The final signing was another carefully orchestrated event. It happened discreetly. Again at Ms. Thorne's office, with witnesses who were not connected to our family. I remember the solemnity of the moment, the quiet rustle of paper as Dad signed his name to the document that would redefine my future and expose the true nature of my family. He looked tired after he signed, but there was a profound sense of peace in his eyes. He squeezed my hand tightly, a silent promise. "It's done, Alina," he whispered, a faint smile touching his lips. "It's all taken care of." That secret, locked away between the three of us, Dad, Miss Thorne, and me, became a silent burden, a powerful knowledge that I carried alone. It was heavy, yes, but it was also a source of quiet strength. Knowing what was coming, knowing the truth of my father's love and foresight, allowed me to endure the coming weeks of their smugness and their cruel assumptions. I became a silent observer, watching them build castles in the air, knowing they were built on sand, and the deeper their delusion, the higher their expectations, the more profound their eventual fall would be. The weeks that followed Dad's death after that initial, brutal dismissal, were a strange, agonizing ballet of false grief and triumphant planning. For them, at least for me, it was a silent vigil, an entrance test of my own making. Every day felt like I was wearing an invisible cloak, watching a play unfold where I was a pivotal character, yet entirely unseen. They didn't even try to hide it. Their certainty that everything was theirs. Why would they? They truly believed it. My mother, with her perpetually pinched expression, suddenly seemed to glow with a quiet satisfaction. Clara, usually so guarded in her ambitions, became almost recklessly open, and Aunt Carol, the ever-present specter of judgment, was practically preening. The conversation started subtly at first, then grew older, more direct. I'd overhear them in the kitchen while making myself a cup of tea, or when they thought I was out of earshot in my room. The curtains in the master bedroom simply must be replaced, Mom would declare, as if Dad's room was already hers, ready for a fresh lick of paint. Something lighter, more airy, Clara would chime in, "And we'll finally get that island in the kitchen, won't we, Mom? Dad always promised, she'd say. As if she was the sole recipient of his every intention. It was a knife twist every time, a casual rewriting of history where my relationship with him, my very existence, was conveniently omitted. I'd just stand there, in the doorway, or walking through the hall, letting their words wash over me. I'd nod vaguely if one of them glanced my way, offering a non-committal hum. They interpreted my silence as sorrow, as acceptance perhaps, even as humility. They saw a broken girl mourning her father and her inheritance, too defeated to fight back, and I let them. Every word they spoke, every excited whisper, every grand plan they laid out, it was all grist for the mill. The higher they built their imagined future, the harder they would fall. They spent hours poring over catalogs, budgeting renovations for the house, which, in their minds, was already Clara's. They talked about converting Dad's beloved study, my favorite room, the sanctuary where he shared his secret, into a modern office space for Clara's burgeoning, vaguely defined online business. So much wasted space with all those old books, Clara would muse, gesturing dismissively towards the shelves that housed Dad's cherished collection. My heart would clench, but I'd keep my face blank. One afternoon, I found Mom and Clara with a contractor walking through the house, tape measures in hand. They were discussing knocking down a wall, opening up the living room to create a more flowing space. They didn't even notice me at first, standing on the stairs listening. When Mom finally saw me, she gave a thin smile. "Oh, Alina dear, just getting some estimates for the improvements Clara wants to make, to really update the place." The unspoken implication hung heavy, now that it's hers. My sister would parade her plans openly, often trying to elicit some kind of reaction from me. I'm thinking of getting a new car too, Alina, something with a little more prestige. Dad would have wanted me to be comfortable, wouldn't he? It was always about what Dad would have wanted for her, never what he truly valued or what he would have wanted for anyone else. Her version of Dad was a caricature, a benevolent financier whose sole purpose was to fulfill her material desires. I'd just offer a bland, That sounds nice, Clara. No emotion, no challenge, just a flat acceptance that drove them subtly mad. I think they wanted a reaction. They wanted me to beg, to protest, to show some sign of feeling that would confirm their narrative of my victimhood. But I gave them nothing. My quiet resilience was my armor. It was a strange, disorienting experience. I would go about my days, performing the rituals of mourning, attending memorial services, accepting condolences from family friends who looked at me with pity, as if my father's death had rendered me truly destitute. All while holding this enormous, explosive secret inside. It was a pressure cooker in my chest, a constant hum beneath my ribs. The knowledge was both a burden and a powerful shield. It protected me from their words, from their sneers, from the deep-seated injustice of it all, because I knew the truth that would shatter their carefully constructed fantasy. Every time they measured curtains, every time they budgeted renovations, every time they gloated in those hushed, conspiratorial whispers, I took it all in. I committed it to memory. It fueled the quiet fire within me. I said nothing, not a single word to betray the secret my father had entrusted me with. I watched them build their house of cards higher and higher, brick by smug brick, oblivious to the storm that was coming, and the anticipation, the grim satisfaction of knowing what awaited them, grew into a formidable force within me. They were erasing the wrong daughter indeed, and soon, they would know it. As the weeks turned into a month, then too, the family's belief in their impending windfall solidified into an almost unbearable arrogance. It wasn't just whispers now. It was open pronouncements delivered with an air of smug superiority that chipped away at my dwindling patience. They had completely forgotten any pretense of shared grief, too consumed by the glittering future they envisioned for themselves, a future built squarely on my exclusion. Their dismissive behavior towards me, always present, became more pronounced, more cutting. It was as if my presence, a quiet reminder of a truth they actively ignored, grated on their nerves. I became a non-person in their eyes, an inconvenient shadow. Oh, Alina, are you still wearing that old thing? Clara would ask, her eyes raking over my perfectly decent, if not designer clothes. Honestly, with Dad gone, you really ought to think about getting a proper job. You can't just lounge around forever. She'd say lounge with a sneer, as if grieving my father and contemplating my future was the height of idleness. The irony of her saying this, given her own nebulous career aspiration, was almost comical. She saw herself as the industrious heiress while I was relegated to the role of the feckless, suddenly impoverished cousin. My mother, once occasionally capable of a fleeting moment of maternal concern, was now entirely consumed by her new role as the matriarch of the main branch of the family. She'd offer me patronizing advice, thinly veiled insults disguised as helpful suggestions. Perhaps you could look into a secretarial course, dear, it's practical. Or maybe some volunteer work to keep you busy. Her tone implied I was a charity case, someone to be managed, a problem to be solved, rather than her daughter. It stung, the way she could erase decades of my life, my accomplishments, my intelligence, with a single, dismissive wave of her hand. They excluded me from everything, openly and without apology. Discussions about the estate, as they grandly called it, took place in hushed tones when I entered the room, or they'd simply change the subject. Clara would frequently leave open spreadsheets on the kitchen table, detailing what she referred to as our projected inheritance, complete with calculations for new investments, a holiday home, even a vaguely outlined trust for her future children. It was a blatant display, a deliberate taunt. I was sure she wanted me to see it, to feel the full weight of what she believed she had taken from me. Even Aunt Carol, who usually maintained a full weight of polite indifference, began to weigh in. It's a shame. Really, Alina, she'd cluck, shaking her head. Such a brilliant man, your father. One would think he'd have ensured everyone was looked after. But you know, some people just don't have that business sense. It was a pointed jab, intended to underscore my supposed financial ineptitude and my father's supposed wisdom in leaving me out. They were all complicit, reinforcing each other's narrative, building a wall of self-serving delusion around themselves. There was one particularly grating incident. Clara was showing off a new, expensive handbag, a gift from Mom, she claimed, a celebration of new beginnings. She swung it casually, letting it brush against my arm as she walked past me in the hall. "It's real leather, Alina," she said, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. "You wouldn't understand, it's an investment piece. Dad would have approved." I wanted to scream, to lash out, to rip that overpriced bag from her hands, but I just offered a small, non-committal shrug. She wanted a reaction, she wanted to see me crumble, and I was determined not to give her that satisfaction. My quiet acceptance, the lack of protest from my end, only seemed to fuel their confidence, making them bolder, more condescending. They interpreted my silence as weakness, as confirmation of my defeat. They believed I was too heartbroken, too inconsequential, or perhaps too unintelligent to challenge their narrative. They mistook my composure for resignation, my controlled breathing for defeat. It was almost comical, had the circumstances not been so deeply painful. They were like children playing with matches in a room full of gasoline, completely oblivious to the explosive reality of the situation. Every smug glance, every whispered plan, every casual slight, etched itself deeper into my memory. They were building their gallows with their own hands, and I, the condemned, was simply watching, waiting for the inevitable moment of truth. My father's secret was a burning ember within me, warming me against their chill, and promising a firestorm that would engulf their carefully constructed arrogance. The final reading was fast approaching, and their descent from their lofty perch was going to be breathtaking. As the weeks bled into the final few days before the official will reading, the air in the house grew thick with anticipation. For my family, it was the culmination of their presumed victory, the official stamp on their inherited dreams. For me, it was the quiet build-up to a storm they couldn't possibly foresee. My emotions were a strange cocktail. There was a trembling nervousness, a fear that somehow, despite my father's meticulous planning, something might still go wrong. What if the lawyer faltered? What if a forgotten clause surfaced? The paranoia was illogical, I knew, but it was a quiet hum beneath my skin. But overriding that fear was a grim satisfaction, a quiet sense of triumph that solidified with each passing hour. I pictured their faces, the moment of revelation, the shattering of their carefully constructed delusion. I imagined the silence that would fall, then the disbelief, followed by the dawning horror. It was not malicious, not entirely. It was the rightful consequence of their cruelty, the inevitable outcome of their profound underestimation. They, meanwhile, were utterly oblivious. Clara was practically giddy, making last-minute calls to designers and real estate agents. My mother was planning an intimate family dinner for the evening of the reading, a celebration of their new wealth. Aunt Carol even bought a new outfit for the occasion, something suitably understated but expensive, for what she clearly viewed as a formal coronation. I spent those last few days in a quiet haze, moving through the house like a ghost. I tried to focus on small tasks, on mundane details, to keep the rising tide of emotion at bay. I mentally rehearsed the moment, steeling myself, preparing for the confrontation that would erupt. I knew it wouldn't be pretty. They wouldn't accept it quietly, but I had my father's foresight, his love, and the unshakable truth on my side. The stage was set. The curtain was about to rise on a scene none of them expected. The day of the final will reading arrived, draped in a false sense of calm. The air in the formal living room, usually stiff with unspoken tension, hummed with an almost festive anticipation. My mother Clara and Aunt Carol were already seated, their posture rigid with expectation. They had dressed meticulously, Clara in a crisp, expensive suit, my mother in her finest pearls, as if attending a coronation. Their faces held a mixture of solemnity for the occasion and ill-concealed triumph for what they believed was about to be confirmed. They eyed the empty chair next to me, clearly expecting an accomplice to their joy, not a bringer of uncomfortable truths. I sat slightly apart, in an antique chair near the window, a quiet observer. My hands were clasped in my lap, betraying none of the tremor within. My heart pounded a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. This was it. The moment my father had so carefully orchestrated was finally upon us. I watched their confident expressions, the little self-satisfied smiles they exchanged, the quick, conspiratorial glances. They were so utterly convinced of their narrative, so oblivious to the reality that was about to crash down on them. Then, the doorbell chimed, a polite, precise sound. Everyone straightened, a collective intake of breath. This wasn't Mr. Harrison, our old family lawyer. This was Miss Thorne. She entered the room with a quiet, professional demeanor. Her briefcase held firmly in one hand. Her presence was understated, yet she commanded immediate attention. She carried herself with an air of quiet authority, her expression serene. She offered a polite, almost imperceptible nod to the assembled family. Her eyes briefly meeting mine before moving on, she settled at the small mahogany desk in the center of the room, arranging her papers with deliberate, unhurried movements. There was a palpable sense of relief from my family. They interpreted her somber professionalism as sympathy, a shared acknowledgement of their recent loss, and the formality of the task ahead. They saw her as a facilitator of their grand plans, a mere instrument to confirm what they already believed. They had no idea she was about to light a match to their entire world. The calm was about to shatter. Ms. Thorne cleared her throat, a small, professional sound that cut through the silent tension. She adjusted her glasses and began to read, her voice even and dispassionate. She started with the usual formalities, the preliminary clauses about debts and funeral arrangements, information that lulled my mother, Clara, and Aunt Carol into a deeper sense of security. I could see the subtle nods, the satisfied glances they exchanged. They were merely waiting for the inevitable, for the part where their names would be called, where their assumed inheritance would be officially declared. But then, her tone shifted ever so slightly. Now, regarding the distribution of assets, my family leaned forward, eager, almost vibrating with anticipation. This was it, in accordance with the wishes of the deceased, Mr. Robert A. Morgan. Miss Thorne continued, her gaze sweeping over the room, briefly meeting mine with a flicker of acknowledgement. All of his tangible and intangible assets, including but not limited to his business holdings, real estate properties, investments, and personal effects are hereby bequeathed, in their entirety to his daughter, Alina Morgan. The words hung in the air, stark and unambiguous, all of it. To me, a sudden, sharp gasp from my mother broke the silence. Clara's jaw dropped, her perfectly made-up face draining of color. Aunt Carol's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide. With shock, for a full, agonizing second, they simply stared, unable to process what they had just heard. It was as if the lawyer had spoken in a foreign language. Ms. Thorne, seemingly oblivious to the seismic shift she had just created, reached into her briefcase with a crisp, precise movement. She produced a set of keys. And these, Ms. Morgan, she said, extending her hand towards me, are the keys to the property. Your father ensured that all necessary documents for immediate transfer of ownership are in order. I stood, my legs feeling strangely light, and walked across the room. My hand trembled ever so slightly as I reached out and took the cold metal keys from her outstretched palm. The weight of them in my hand felt monumental. It wasn't just a set of keys. It was the symbol of my father's unwavering trust, his fierce love, and his ultimate act of protection. As the keys settled in my grip, I could feel their stunned gazes burning into me. The truth, silent for so long, had finally undeniably been unveiled. The keys felt strangely heavy in my palm, a tangible weight against the sudden, shocking lightness in the room. The silence that followed Miss Thorne's declaration wasn't just a lack of sound. It was a vacuum, a gaping hole where their carefully constructed world used to be. My mother's gasp had been the first sign, Clara's slack jaw the second. Now, it was a collective, stunned stillness that descended upon them. I didn't look at them right away. I focused on the keys, their cold metal against my skin, grounding me. But I could feel their eyes on me, a physical pressure. When I finally lifted my gaze, it wasn't just shock I saw on their faces. It was something far more profound, and infinitely more satisfying. It was recognition, not just the shock of being disinherited, though that was clearly searing them. No, it was the dawning, horrifying realization that they had erased the wrong daughter. They saw me, truly saw me, for the first time in years. They saw the quiet, observant girl they had dismissed, the one they had belittled and excluded, now standing tall, holding the very keys to their future. Their eyes widened, not just with disbelief, but with a visceral understanding of the monumental mistake they had made, the color drained from Clara's face, leaving it ashen, her triumph. So recently displayed, curdled into a bitter, horrified understanding. My mother's usually rigid posture seemed to crumple, her mouth working soundlessly, unable to form words. Aunt Carol, usually so composed, looked utterly bewildered, as if she had walked into an alternate reality. The air crackled with their unspoken accusations, their instant regret, their sheer, unadulterated fury, all directed at themselves, and then at me. They saw their arrogance reflected in my quiet composure, their dismissal thrown back in their faces by my undeniable truth, their faces contorted, a kaleidoscope of emotions, betrayal, disbelief, anger, and perhaps a fleeting shadow of shame. The recognition was a punch to their gut, a truth they could no longer deny. The invisible cloak I had worn for weeks disintegrated, revealing not a broken girl, but the rightful inheritor. The realization on their faces was a canvas of pure, unadulterated devastation. It wasn't just about the money, though that was clearly a huge part of their shock. It was about the narrative. The story they had so painstakingly constructed for themselves, the one where I was insignificant, easily discarded, a footnote in their grand design. That story had just been ripped to shreds. My mother, usually so composed, looked utterly lost. Her eyes darted from Miss Thorne to me, then to the keys in my hand, as if willing them to disappear. Clara's face was a mask of disbelief. Her lips parted in a silent scream. She finally managed to articulate a choked sound, something between a gasp and a whine. Aunt Carol, always the pragmatic one, seemed to be running frantic calculations in her head, trying to make sense of the sudden, catastrophic reversal. This can't be right. My mother finally stammered, her voice thin and reedy. Ms. Thorne, ever professional, simply offered a polite, "All legal documents have been thoroughly verified, Mrs. Morgan. Mr. Morgan's wishes are explicit and legally binding." I said nothing, there was no need. My presence holding those keys was eloquence enough. Every slight, every dismissive comment, every exclusion, every smug whisper about their inheritance, it all came crashing down around them. Their elaborate plans for renovations, the new car, the designer bags, the sense of entitlement they had so brazenly displayed, it was all a cruel joke, played on themselves. They saw me then, not as the ghost they had tried to make me, but as the daughter who had been quietly, legally, empowered by the very man they had presumed to understand. The recognition in their eyes was the bitter realization that their cruelty hadn't weakened me. It had merely set the stage for my father's ultimate act of love. They realized they had erased the wrong daughter, and in that moment the power shifted, irrevocably and completely. If Alina's story resonated with you, imagine the power of uncovering your own hidden strengths. Hit that like button if you've ever felt underestimated. Subscribe for more true stories of quiet resilience and unexpected triumphs. And in the comments below, share a time you proved everyone wrong. Let's build a community of empowerment.